Good evening. I would like to begin by saying thank you to everyone that is watching our presentation. Our paper is entitled COVID-19 Pandemic in Brazilian Therapeutic Context: A View Through Systemic Functional Linguistics Lenses, and the study has been conducted by me, José Marinho, Marcelo de Souza Pontes Alves, and our advisor, Professor Elaine Espindola. Before I begin, I would like to introduce our team. As I have mentioned before, my name is José Marinho, and I have a master's degree in linguistics historiography, obtained by the Federal University of Paraíba, UFPB. Marcelo de Souza is a Brazilian English teacher, translator, and undergraduate student at the same university. And Elaine Espíndola is a professor in the Federal University of Paraíba, associated to the Department of Modern Foreign Languages. Her research interests lie in applied linguistics to professional contexts. She is also the Director of International Mobility at the same university. This presentation will be divided into 6 different sections. The first will present the context, and as the name implies, in this section we are going to present the circumstances in which our research was conducted. Following, we have the relevance of the research, where the main contributions of this study will be presented. In the next moment, we have a methodological framework and the theoretical framework, which will contain the foundations used to guide our study. And lastly, we will present the analysis of the data. In this section, we will discuss the main findings we have found while conducting the study. The context. This study has been conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and amidst this global public health crisis, we have aimed to analyze the language used in the therapeutic context. Since the beginning of this period, we, researchers, have noticed how people were externalizing their feelings and become eager to understand how their lives were affected by such life-changing conditions. The therapeutic environment, where many would seek comfort from this context, was also affected by the global pandemic, as most appointments transited from offices to be held online. As a consequence, an unusual change affected such environment. We consider this study relevant because it will help us to understand some points. The first relates to how feelings are affected by the context, as it is possible to say that feelings are produced through language in a controlled environment that is the therapeutic setting. This understanding will be allowed by SFL. The second is the relationship between language and the linguistics choices used by the participants of the therapeutic discourse and the pandemic context. Since we focus to investigate how the patient and the psychologist represented and evaluated events related to the current pandemic situation and how they use language to express this relationship. After this, we'll be able to map feelings that emerged in our data, the frequency in which they happen, and analyze the possible impacts of the therapeutic setting in this matter. Methodological framework. As I said before, for this study, we are looking at a recorded therapy session that was carried out in Brazil. Considering the pandemic context that we are living in, it was recorded in the Google Meet platform where the session took place. It's important to mention that the data was collected by the therapists who used the codes of ethics of the clinic. The professional recorded the sessions using a mobile recorder so that we would access the voices only. Understanding the importance of having a data as solid as possible, we transcribed this therapy session following the guides provided in eggs and slate. The participants involved in this study were the psychologist and the patient. Both were consulted and signed a term giving us the authorization of using this data in this study. The goal of the study. This study aims at observing the relationship between the transitivity system and the evaluation of attitude realized by a patient during a therapy session. In other words, we intend to analyze which kind of effects were textualized in our data and how the participants use the process to express this relationship.
So, as Eric already introduced me, I am Marceli Alves and I will carry on with the presentation from this point on. So, bearing in mind that not everyone here participating in the conference might be familiar with SFL theory and the appraisal system, I intend to highlight some general aspects of them that guided our research. Regarding SFL, it understands that grammar is necessary for a clear understanding of the meaning and effectiveness of the text. Language is thus seen as a social practice, and its use is motivated by a purpose. In this sense, SFL investigates the ways in which people produce language in context, studying the use of language in social contexts, considering its aspects of interaction and communication. In other words, we use language to produce meaning in a social context and to achieve a purpose. Another important principle of SFL is that of choices that are made by the participants within a range of options in each context, and in our case, the context is online therapy. Language is a resource used to create meaning. Thus, when we produce a text, we are performing the metafunctions. The metafunctions are the ideational, interpersonal, and textual. I'm not going to explain all of them, but Halliday and Matthiessen suggest that the clause has its communicative objective determined by these three types of interdependent meanings, and that is, they unfold simultaneously. Within the ideational metafunction, there is the transitivity system, and through this system, it's possible to interpret word experience as a set of manageable process types. The processes are like primary colors and secondary. So in this case here, the primary would be the material process, which indicates an external experience like actions and events. The mental process indicating internal experiences such as memories, reactions, reflections, a state of mind. And finally, the relational process, which in general line is the representation of relations and are usually expressed with verbs such as to be and to have. The secondary ones would be the behavioral process that could be a psychological or physiological manifestation, for example, to sleep, to eat. The verbal process representing linguistic activities, and finally, the existential process, which is the existence of something in the word and is commonly realized by the verb there is and there are. Through the 6 types of processes, it is possible to deeply analyze and understand discourse. Another system that came from SFL is the appraisal system that we also use as a theoretical framework here. And this system is discussed by language scientists such as Martin and White as a theoretical methodological framework capable of identifying in speech lexical-grammatical elements through which participants place themselves to construct their beliefs, judgments, word experiences, affection, among other contextual and individual elements performed in speech. So this is the general highlight of our theoretical framework. Here, I present to you the table with the partial results we have obtained so far. This vertical column represents the appraisal system. You can see that most of the categories have a positive evaluation and a negative. For example, happiness and unhappiness. For normality, we use the term non-normality as the negative evaluation, which is kind of self-explanatory. It breaks away with what the participant evaluates as normal for them. It is also important to mention that José, Eric, and I used color coding during the analysis. However, the colors do not interact with each other. It was solely a visual aid for us to better visualize the data. Here in the horizontal column, we can see the transitivity system. And the numbers here represent the occurrences of each process type in the appraisal system. For example, when there was expressions of normality, we had occurrence of 11 relational clauses. These clauses, the relational clauses, are more commonly used to represent beings in the world, their attributes, but also to facilitate narrating events and describing scenarios or participants. It is interesting to note that overall, when there were manifestations of normality here, the patient was usually narrating their life before the pandemics. When we looked at this data, it became clearer and confirmed some of our initial hypotheses, because the patient was indeed verbalizing a description of their life before the pandemics and describing people and other participants, most in these relational clauses here, in which the main characteristic is like describing people and places and narrating stories to facilitate the narration. Another number that verified our initial hypothesis is the only occurrence of happiness here related to a mental clause, which will be further addressed in the next slides. It is important to note that when we categorize, for example, happiness or unhappiness, we're not only talking in the sense of being happy or sad, but rather an entire scope of how the participant creates meaning through language and expresses their word experiences. So it's not only about being happy or sad, but there's a whole scope behind these two categories. So here, for a deeper analysis, I selected and translated a couple of examples. This is the first one. Just so you know, BP stands for Brazilian Portuguese, whereas ET means English translation. From now on, the patient's speech starts with P. For this presentation, I chose to analyze only the patient's discourse. However, it should be noted that the psychological approach employed by the professional impacts the interaction. Here in the first line, the patient says in the BP, as palavras que eu anotei: amigos, futebol, vazio, família, desencontro de ideias, e amanhã o dia vai ser quase o mesmo. I translated for the following in English. The things I wrote down: friends, soccer, emptiness, family, inconsistent thoughts, and tomorrow my day will be the same. I translated for this, aiming to keep the feeling expressed by the patient the same, as well as choosing the most appropriate verb. The work with the two languages, although it may seem very difficult at first, it's actually quite interesting because it provides an opportunity for us to work with more lexical items and also the possibility for deeper linguistic understanding. So here in the first example, the patient lists things they miss, like friends, soccer, etc., and they state that their day will be almost the same. So as I mentioned before, one aspect of the relational clause is narrative as well as assigning attributes. And regarding the normality, the patient describes what is part of their daily life, things that they are used to. Then, this second line here is the sequence of their speech. In BP, it says, e essas coisas estão sendo as coisas que eu sinto mais falta. E aí eu comecei a falar para minha mãe. Comecei a chorar e ela falou, nossa, calma. Now in English. And those are the things I miss the most. And then I started talking to my mom. Then I started crying and she said, "Whoa, calm down." The things the patient said they miss are listed in the first example, like friends, soccer, etc. here. Then we see an expression of unhappiness in the second example, because there is a general idea of something missing, like missing something here, followed by the patient venting to their mother and then crying. The processes that appear here are mental when the patient is talking about an internal experience of missing something when they say, "I miss the most." It's verbal when they talk to their mother, "I started talking." And finally, behavior when they cry. They say they cry, "I started crying." So this would be the behavior clause. This data verifies the appraisal analysis in the sense that in evaluating unhappiness, the patient uses a mental process that regards their reflections as well as state of mind, mood, and memories, and also they verbalize it to someone else. And finally, there's the behavioral process of crying, which is one of our initial hypotheses to verify how people are feeling right now during the pandemics, and how they construct this discourse of anxiety. In this next example, the patient said, here in BP, "Onde eu morava", que no caso é um lugar que me sinto bem e tal. Fui trocar umas ideias com eles e a gente tinha combinado já de comprar umas bebidas e tal. Beber. Now in English. It was the place where I lived, which in this case is a place I feel safe and stuff. So I went to hang out with them, friends, and we had already agreed to buy some drinks and stuff to drink. The focus of this part is when the patient talks about a place they lived before, which is a place where they feel safe. In this moment, there is an evaluation of security and also happiness. Considering that a place, be that a home or a neighborhood, in this case means feeling at home, feeling secure and welcomed, and the patient verbalizes that they feel safe, they feel good to be back there with friends. This is realized by a mental process, once again focusing on the patient's internal experiences. It was the only data of happiness that appeared up to the present moment of the analysis. So this is why I brought this example, because it was quite interesting and it was the only occurrence of happiness that we had up until the moment. Here in the final examples I chose, it was to illustrate something that we actually expected, but it was mind-blowing to actually see the numbers. The relation between the evaluation of incapacity and mental processes are high. Up to now, we had 11 occurrences. So first here, the patient reports a moment they were feeling anxious and incapable of drawing conclusions, as if their mind was hazy or something like this. In Portuguese, they said, eu pensava, nossa, não, mas eu vou fazer tal coisa. Mas não chegava a nenhuma conclusão de nada, tipo, nada para mim fazia sentido, não melhorava. In English, they said, yeah, I would think like, okay, yeah, alright, I'll do this and that, but I couldn't draw a conclusion about anything, like, nothing made sense to me, it didn't get better. Then here, the psychologist uses an interjection to encourage the patient to go on. He says, then the patient says, não conseguia conectar nada, which in English I translated for, I wasn't able to make sense out of anything. And once again, the patient is reporting not being able to think properly due to anxiety. It is interesting that throughout most of what we analyzed thus far, the evaluation of incapacity is connected to internal phenomena expressed by mental processes. Not only this, but there was a process of self-reflection about these feelings until the patient actually verbalized it to the psychologist. Also, thinking about the general context of the research, the pandemics, and remote therapy, this was a result that we expected to be significant, but actually seeing the numbers so high was really striking and worrisome. Thank you for your time. Obrigada.